That update. Here we are in Psalms 3 tonight, and we have started in this series of messages, and I have to tell you that I am thrilled about the message tonight and the fact that I think there's something here for all of us, and I pray that God will speak to our hearts in a very unusual way tonight. Beginning in verse number 1, it says, "Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help. There is no help for him in God." And you have that little word, Selah. "But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill." And there's that word again, Selah. "I laid me down and slept. I awaked, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people. Selah." Now I want you to notice something tonight. This is this psalm, as you look at it, we start reading in verse number 1, but I want you to see what it says in your Bible before verse number 1. These things that are stated here is much of the Scripture. Though we don't read that little bit of introduction, it is included in the sacred writing. And here's what it says: "A psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son." Now, when I read that little title, it tells me immediately that David was dealing with an extreme moment of difficulty in his life. And it certainly sets for us the tone of this psalm. And David had been used to, as a young man, as you go back and you look over his life, he had been used to fleeing from people. And specifically, for a number of years, he fled as a young man, as God had anointed him as the next king of Israel, and Saul was aware of that. And Saul, of course, his jealousy, his envy, wanting to destroy David, and so he chased David for a number of years. And during that time in which David was being pursued, David had a conviction. That conviction was that he would not lift up his hand against God's anointed. Even though he had plenty of opportunities, even though there were situations and circumstances where David could have very easily killed Saul, he was of the conviction that God had anointed this man to be the king of Israel, and it wasn't up to him to remove him. And so even though he was being hunted, he would not lift up his hand against Saul. Now, I want you to see that in this particular situation, it's different. There's a difference here in this particular psalm, because David is not running from Saul, he's running from his own son, Absalom. I don't know if you understand the sadness in that, but there's a great amount of sadness that's contained in that thought, that here's a man who is running from his own flesh and blood, the one that he fathered, the one that he birthed, the one that he raised, and now is running from this son. You know, every man's going to have their detractors. Every person is going to have those who don't like where they stand, the positions that they hold. I think we see that on a national scale. The president is not well liked by many people, and there are other people in the administration that are not well liked, and there are some people that I don't well like in national politics. And I'm sure there are people that don't like me. But truthfully, every man and every person is going to have their detractors. But, you know, honestly, there's not a man in the Bible that stood for God. There's not a man in the Bible who took a position for God that didn't have some people that fussed at him and kind of nagged at him a little bit. I think some had open hostility, open opposition. Do you not remember Joseph? We've been studying him in the adult auditorium Bible class. We've in a series of lessons about Joseph and his brothers, his own brothers. Sold him into slavery. They wanted to kill him, and had they had the opportunity, had not the Midianite caravan come through, they probably would have killed their own brother. And so it's a sad story. Here were people who disliked Joseph, and of course we find Moses was fussed at and betrayed and berated by the very people that he delivered. And we find that Jeremiah was ridiculed because he preached the truth, and he was placed in prison. And we know, of course, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, could not have been more perfect. He was the sinless, holy Son of God. And yet from the moment of His birth, there were those who wanted to take His life. And so we think about that, and I'm not minimizing into that tonight, but when I think about this situation, I think you would agree with me, when your own flesh and blood turns against you and plots your death, that's a pretty sad situation and circumstance in life. Now this story is recorded in all its vivid detail in 2 Samuel chapter 15, through chapter 19. And we're not going to take the time to look at that story tonight. We'll turn there in just a few moments and look at a few passages. But in the end, we find that Absalom is killed by Joab, one of David's generals, and the coup has failed. And David is heartbroken. He's heartbroken for his son on two fronts. He's heartbroken that his son would rise up against him, and then he's heartbroken because his son has to die in that revolt. And so there's a sense of sadness as David mourns this and this uprising. Now let me point out a couple things for you tonight that are found in this psalm before we even begin to deal with the psalm itself. Would you notice something? This is the first time, and of course we've dealt with Psalms chapter 1 and chapter 2, but this is the first time in an introduction that the term psalm is used. Now, I don't know if you have ever done a study on words in the Bible, but words that God chooses and selects are important words. And so the term psalm comes from a Hebrew word, and here's what it means. It has to do with a pruning or a cutting off of superfluous twigs. And in this psalm, you can see that David is not using flowery speeches. He's not making a political speech here. He's cutting to the quick. He's using short little sentences that speak of his heart and speak of his burden. So a psalm is just kind of cutting away with all the stuff and just kind of getting right down to business. And so the Bible uses that term of this. I was thinking today about the Gettysburg Address. I'm not exactly sure. I think it's 260 some words that are contained in the Gettysburg Address. And we all know of our president, President Lincoln, that made that address at Gettysburg when they dedicated that cemetery. What most people don't realize is that Mr. Lincoln was not even invited to speak. He was the president of the country, and the man who was to dedicate the cemetery went on for an hour and a half, just droning on and on and on. And people felt, well, the president's coming, we probably should let him say something. They weren't real happy that he was coming, but he was coming to dedicate this cemetery. And that short little speech, 260 words, has lived for 140 some years because of its power. It's just short and to the point. And I'm just simply thinking that sometimes, we think that we've got to use all the words in the world, and we've got to go on and on and on and on and on. I remember one time I was preaching at a nursing home. It was the funniest thing that ever happened. Brother Woven tells this story. Of course, he always embellishes the truth just a little bit. But I was preaching at this nursing home over here on Lorraine Avenue in North Olmsted. And I just got up and just started to speak, and this little woman sitting in a wheelchair said, there he goes again. He just goes on and on and on and on and on. Is he going to be quiet? He's just going on and on and on and on and on. And I think sometimes we feel that about preachers. They just go on and on and on and on. And sometimes I think we can just get right to the point and get it done and just say what needs to be said. And that's what a psalm does. There's a second thing that I want to point out to you here, and that's in this passage. This is the first time that we see that little Hebrew word Selah used. Now let me just simply say this, that I've often said, and because I've heard this taught and heard it preached, and in study I found this to be true, that it is really a term that speaks to the musical aspect of it, because the Psalms were set to music. And oftentimes I've heard that little word Selah means to rest. In other words, you make the statement and then you just stop for a moment and you pause, probably for emphasis' sake. Well, here's what I came to understand today as I'm studying this portion of Scripture out. That little word Selah says more than just stop. In music, there's also another, and obviously I'm an expert on music. I know music so well. But in music, there's a thing called a crescendo. And a crescendo builds to a point, and basically what a crescendo does is it says, let's belt this out, let's give this power, let's punch this thing. Well, basically that's again what this word Selah means. It means to just when you get to that point, you just kind of give that some emphasis. One of the commentators I read today, John Phillips, in his commentary, he said that it draws attention to that sentence that's being sung or to that thought that's being expressed. And he said, quote, another explanation for the word means there. What do you think of that? And so when you stop to think of it for just a moment, let's stop and think about, what do you think about that? Look at verse number 2 again, would you please? Many there be that say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. Well, what do you think about that? It's almost as David stopping and saying, hey, I want to tell you that's a ridiculous thought. What do you think about that? That they say there's no help for me in God. He says it again in verse number 4. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and He heard me out of His holy hill. Hey, what do you think about that? Hey, there is some help in God. And then He says in verse number 8, don't you love this? Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon Thy people. Hey, what do you think about that? It's good stuff. And so from now on, maybe when you're reading through the Psalms, you maybe think about that thing with just some punch and just stop and pause there and let it just kind of dwell in your mind and build up and just kind of sing that thing out. There is salvation in the Lord for His people. Now, let me go through this psalm very quickly with you tonight. And let me give you 3 thoughts from this psalm. Would you notice, first of all, the great trial that's found here in verses 1 and 2. Would you notice again, it says, he says, Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. Selah. Now let me stop and let's talk for just a few moments. Let's spend just a few moments talking about this great trial of David's life. Let me first of all say to you about this trial that it was the residual effect from David's great sin. This situation that David is dealing with, when you study it out, you realize that this rebellion came from within David's own family. Nobody prompted Absalom to do what he did. There was nobody that came to Absalom and said, well, Absalom, why don't you just go ahead and just kind of knock the feet out from underneath your dad? Why don't you take the throne from him? Why don't you plot his death? Why don't you plan an overthrow so that you can kill your own father? But when you realize and study the life of David, you realize that David's sin, his great sin, is recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 11, where when the kings went forth to battle and David stayed behind, and one night as he's walking on the top of the palace, he looks over and sees this beautiful woman washing herself, and David inquires after the woman and finds out that she's married to one of his mighty men by the name of Uriah. It'd be like, if you ran a business and you had men who sat on the executive board and you had an affair with one of those great men of stature, and then you plotted his death. And that's what David did. He took Uriah's life and he had an affair with his wife, and that great sin. And you remember how he thought that he had covered it, and God sent Nathan the prophet to him. One of the end statements, and it's a great statement in the Bible. If you haven't underscored it in your Bible, you ought to underscore it. 2 Samuel chapter 11, I believe it's the last verse, and here's what it says. Howbeit the thing that David did displeased the Lord. I got to tell you something, friend. God knew, and by the way, God knows all about your life. He knows all about my life. There isn't anything that we can hide from the God of heaven. He sees all things. We may think we've gotten away with it. We may think we've covered it. We may think we've covered our tracks. But God knows, and He will not let His people get away with one thing. And so God sends Nathan the prophet in chapter 12, and he confronts David with a parable, and David gets furious. And he said this, he pronounced his own sentence. He said, He will restore the lamb 4 times or fourfold. And God says through Nathan the prophet, you are the man, and for the rest of your life you will suffer, and the sword will never depart from your house. You study out the life of David, there was family turmoil in David's home. There was nothing but anger and hostility, and there were problems because David had sinned against God. Now someone may say, well, didn't David get right with God? Yeah, read Psalm 51. He got right with God. No question about it. He got right with God. And I do believe that God probably softened the blow just a little bit, but that when we sin and when the sentence is passed, I want to tell you something, friend. You don't do away with the repercussions of your sin even when you get right with God. We've got to stop a little bit and think. Sometimes, we get so short-sighted as people, do we not? We can see the immediate and we can see the pleasure of the immediate, but we have such a hard time seeing the long-term effects of the decisions we make. I want to tell you that, we better stop. Young people that are sitting here tonight, you young adults that are sitting here, you young couples that are sitting here tonight, those of us who are older ought to stop here tonight and say, hey, you know what? I can't afford to sin. The cost of sin is more than I want to pay. It's going to cost me more than I even think about at this moment. I made this statement today, and you may not think it's so deep. I think it's a pretty good statement. I wrote it down. I said, sin is like a debt. It's like debt. It's so easy to get into, but it takes such a long time to pay it off. Now, I'm not talking about, of course, the dealing with our sin. I'm talking about the practical outworking of our sin. Oh man, you can sin today, you can sin today and you can get right with God, but I'm going to tell you something, there's going to be residual effects of your sin in your life. We need to understand that and understand that there is a God who's compassionate, a God who cares, but we need to understand that there is long-term effects. And so this is a residual effect. This great difficulty in David's life, this great trial in David's life came because of his own sin. I find in this trial it happened because the younger generation had been influenced by Absalom. There are two things that are obvious. Which notice in verse number 1, David is crying, and here's what he says. He says, How are they increased that trouble me? The thought that's contained in that idea is that the numbers of those that were siding with Absalom were growing and David's numbers were diminishing. I want you to go with me to 2 Samuel chapter 15 for just a moment. And you read this story of Absalom's rebellion here. And Absalom places himself in the early portion of this passage for the maximum effect. I want you to see that here because he's a very suave young man. He's a very smooth young man, very slick in his operation. I believe Absalom is probably around 40 years of age, at least from the wording here that the indication is. And it says, And it came to pass after this that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. So he had a following to start with. He got 50 young guys who are probably just as slick as he is, and all these king wannabes, and he's promised them a position on his court. And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. He stood at the gate where the people came in to come to the city to see the king. And it was so that when any man had a controversy against the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, Oh, what city art thou? And he said, Thy servant is from one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. What he's simply saying is, it's too bad you had to come all this way to hear the king. If the king had had a little bit of sense, he'd have put all these deputies out there, all these judges out there in the city. You wouldn't have to make this trip all the way to see the king. Well, that's what he's saying. Verse number 4, Absalom said, Moreover, oh, that I were made a judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come to me, and I would do him justice. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. And on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. Now notice what it says. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Hey, this wasn't just because Absalom was a nice guy. He did this on purpose. This was all part of the plot to overthrow his father. He was angry at his father. He was mad at his dad. And so he set it up so that he could steal the hearts of the people away. Look at you, if you would, at verse number 10 for just a moment. In this same chapter, it says, But Absalom sent spies through all the tribes of Israel, saying, As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. And when Absalom went, and with Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in their simplicity and knew not anything. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from his city, and from Gilo, and while he offered sacrifices, and this conspiracy was strong. Now notice what it says, For the people increased continually with Absalom. So putting that in perspective, in our passage in Psalm chapter 3, David said, Hey, Lord, the numbers are growing. These people that are rising up against me, it's obvious that the numbers are not in my favor. I'll tell you, this younger crowd that followed Absalom, they didn't know David. Now understand, David's an older man now. He's not the striking young man. It's been years since he stood in the valley of Elah, and I'm sure that was still part of their history, and I'm sure the story was still told, but David's an older man. He's not as young as he once was. He's perhaps maybe he's failing just a little bit. So here comes young Absalom to begin to steal that kingdom away, and he's so smooth and striking in his appearance and smooth in his speech, and he implies the time has come for a new king and a new approach to the kingdom. I can just hear him now, my father's ways. He didn't say this outwardly, that's what he's saying. My father's ways are antiquated. We need to get up to speed. We need to be more sophisticated in what we're doing. I tell you, as I think about that thought, I think about this, that across the country there are a bunch of Absaloms today. They're coming into fundamental Baptist churches that have been set in the old paths, and these young bucks come out of school, and they know more than the preacher that's been there for years and have pastored those people and led them and stood in the old paths and the proven paths and know which way to walk and what's right with God. And these young guys come along and say, oh, that way's antiquated. We don't need that way anymore. And they begin an undertone in the church, and begin to appeal to the younger crowd. Not long before there's an uprising and a split in the church. I'm telling you, friend, we need to understand that Absalom's ways are still at work today in our world. And I find that the younger crowd was influenced. Would you notice the second prevailing thought in verse number 2? Not only the numbers were increasing, but the prevailing thought in verse number 2 was that God was finished with David. That's what it says in verse number 3. Many there be that say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. That word help, it means the word help, but it also talks about salvation. In other words, God's not going to help him. God's not going to save him. And David adds that little word, Selah, on the end of that, at the end of that statement. Well, what do you think about that? These people that say there is no help for me in God. Well, obviously David didn't believe that. Look at verse number 3. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter up of my head. I'm just simply saying that people thought that God was finished with David. Do you remember what happened when David fled from Jerusalem? Remember, there was a man by the name of Shimei who was a relative of Saul's. And we won't take time to turn to 1 Samuel 16, but you get the picture there. This man Shimei, who was Saul's relative, began to curse David when he came out of the city. So not only has his son rebelling against him, he's got this guy who's rebelling against him, throwing rocks at him and cursing him and saying, you're just a bloody man, David. You deserve what you got, and God's bringing judgment upon your head. So I believe in verse number 1, we have the numbers that are increasing. Verse number 2, we have those people with a kind of a reference to Shimei and other people thinking, well, David's getting his justice, or God must be punishing David, and he's getting what he deserves, and God's finished with him. In that end of verse number 2, you find that word Selah. It just emphasizes, well, God, what do you think about that? And I think what he's simply saying is, God, you know that's not true. Would you notice not only the great trial, but secondly, would you notice the great trust that's found in this passage? Verse number 3, we find David's dependence upon God. He says, verse number 3, but thou, O Lord, art a shield for me and my glory and the lifter up of my head. Now realize that David's in trouble here. A calm world that turned chaotic, and a lot of people wanted David dead. They didn't just want David's throne, they wanted him dead. They wanted him laid out on a bier someplace. They wanted him buried. They wanted him placed in the ground. And so David was fleeing, and this isn't a pretty picture. This is not a wonderful place to be at this point as far as David's life is concerned. And in the midst of this turmoil, David draws upon the surety of God's promise. Now remember that God had shared with David that he was going to do some great things through David's life. And one of the things that God promised David was that he would sit upon the throne, and there would always be a successor. One of his own offspring would sit upon his throne, but obviously David realized that it wasn't going to come like this. And when I look at verse number 3, I find all this turmoil going on, but do you not see that in the midst of that, David finds a way to glorify God? Do you understand sometimes that while some of the most negative and difficult things can fall out upon us as people, there are no guarantees that you're going to get through life without having some battles. In fact, you're going to face some. And there are going to be some hardships and some difficulties. But let me just simply say tonight that normally speaking, it's easy to glorify God when everything's going well. But man, I'm telling you, does God not get more glory when things are not going so well and we can still praise Him? I mean, does He not bring more glory to Himself that when everything in our life is falling apart, but we just simply say, you know what? Though He slay me, I'll still serve Him. And I'm just simply saying that's what David is doing here. His life is falling apart, but David is saying, I'm going to talk to you about my dependence upon God. And then I want you to see, not only makes his dependence upon God very clear, but he makes a declaration about God in verse number 4. Look at it. I cried unto the Lord my voice, and He heard me out of His holy hill. You know, those that hated David said, man, there's no salvation for him. God's not going to hear him. But David said, not so. I cried unto the Lord, and He heard me. Now, there have been periods of difficulty in David's life. As you go study his life, we shared that there were times when he was hunted. I love the story of David, and I taught in my Sunday school class a couple of weeks ago. We were dealing with a series of lessons called Treasures of Darkness. And basically that comes back to what I just said just a few moments ago. When life falls apart, how do you handle it? And we were studying about David, and I may have mentioned this in another message I preached not long ago, how David really got to Ziklag, and he had been out, and had returned, and the troops were weary and tired. They were looking forward to coming home and cresting a hill, looking forward to when they got to the top of the hill, seeing the children playing in the meadows, seeing their kids, and smelling the smoke from the fireplaces where the food was cooking. Well, when they crested the hill, they didn't see anybody playing. And when they crested the hill, they saw that the city had been set on fire by the Amalekites, and all their loved ones and all their things, all the material things of their life had been carried away, and all the physical people in their life had been carried away. And the Bible says that the people were so discouraged, and it was a difficult moment, and the people spoke of stoning David because of the difficulty. And I got to tell you, I really believe that Ziklag was a turning point in David's life. I believe it was the test that God had put in David's life. I believe God gives tests, and I believe He put some tests out there for Saul. When He said to Saul, hey, Saul, go kill all the Amalekites, and Saul failed the test because he lived on his own agenda. Well, here was a test in David's life before he's made the king. Think about the test. David, are you going to trust me when things are difficult and you can't see how they're all going to work out? Are you going to keep on believing? Or are you going to go ahead and just throw up your hands and live like the rest of the world? When all those people were so discouraged and they spoke of stoning David, the Bible is very clear. And here's what it said. It says, David encouraged himself in the Lord. And I got to tell you, it wasn't long before God had delivered all those people back to David. And it wasn't long before David was sitting on the throne of the king, as the king of Israel in Jerusalem. I'm just simply saying, David had learned to trust God. And one of the areas that we have trouble with is accepting that God has dealt with us and has put away our sin. I tell you, sometimes people have such a hard time. And, I think what people were saying here is, hey, David, maybe God's still dealing with you. Maybe God isn't going to hear you because you're still dealing with that sin in the past. I deal with people all the time, and, they come to me and say, preacher, I blew it. Well, I wish you hadn't. And you ought to live so that you don't. And I want to tell you something. When you do blow it, you can come to God and make it right. That doesn't mean there's not going to be residual effect. But here's what people do. They beat themselves up forever sometimes. And I'm going to tell you there's a difference between conviction and guilt, folks. And let me tell you what the difference is. Guilt is when we get something right with God and the devil just keeps beating us up over what we did. If you got it right with God, God's forgotten it and you ought to put it behind you. Conviction is that when we haven't got it right with God, God says, you need to get it right with me. There is a great difference. And so David is here saying, hey, you know what? I've gotten it right with God. I called on the Lord and He heard me and He's helped me. Now let's quickly look at the last portion of this. Notice the great triumph found in verses 5 to 8. I love verses 5 and 6. I laid me down and slept. This is the most difficult moment of David's life. I mean, life is crushing in around him. His son is turned against him. He's fleeing from the city. He said, I laid me down and slept. I awake, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. I see David as he's tired. He's an older man. He's long past the glory days of his youth. Well, I'll tell you what, the older you get, the more you realize that you don't have what you used to have. I'll tell you that. And I'm not an old man, but I know I'm not 30 years old anymore either. I'm not 25. But the truth of the matter is David's old and he's older and he's what he lacks in physical ability, he makes up in wisdom. So he puts some distance between himself and his enemies. He's done all humanly that he can do. And it's almost as if he gets to that point, and he's cried to the Lord in verse number 4, and the Lord heard him. Now just think about this for just a moment. It's night. It's probably an open field situation. And David doesn't know. I mean, from a human physical standpoint, he doesn't know where Absalom is. He doesn't know if they're going to attack while they're trying to get some rest. But it's almost as if David gets to a point where he just looks up to the God in heaven and says, God, you're in control of it all. Good night, Lord. I'll see you in the morning. Sometimes I think we just have to get to that point in our life. You can't do anything about it. I don't know about you, but I've been many a time when I woke up in the midnight hour. Been many a time when I awaken and thinking, Lord, how am I going to deal with this? This problem's too big for me. And I'll toss and I'll turn. I got to tell you, there are times when I wish that I could just be like David, say, look to heaven and say, God, ain't nothing I'm going to do about this tossing and turning. Good night. My wife accuses me of doing that every night. But the truth of the matter is, there's rest. David found rest in the Lord in this passage. Absalom had the numbers, but get a hold of this. David had God. What would you rather have? Numbers or God? Then would you notice David's resilience? Look at verses 7 and 8. We find his rest in verses 5 and 6, but his resilience is found in verses 7 and 8. Here's what he says in verse number 7. Arise, O Lord. Let me help you understand that. When Israel came out of Egypt, God manifested His presence among the people. How did He do it? Well, He put a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And when God moved, the people were to move. Well, remember when they came out of Egypt and God led them with that pillar of fire, and so He's leading them and they've left Egypt. Well, you also remember that it wasn't long before Pharaoh said, you know what, we made the biggest mistake of our life. We let these people go. We're going to go get them. So here comes Pharaoh with all his men and all of his chariots, and they're marching against Israel, and the people turn around and they're so afraid. Well, what did God do? God turned around and instead of being in front of him, he went behind him and separated, put a separation between Israel and Egypt. Well, basically, when you think about what God did and they passed through the Red Sea, who fought for Israel? It was God. They didn't enter into a physical battle with those people. God parted the Red Sea. They went across the other side. And Pharaoh said, well, if you can do it, we can do it. And God said, not so. God fought against them. So every time that you find, and here's a statement that is found in Numbers chapter 10, verse number 35. And it came to pass when the ark set forward that Moses said, rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee before thee. So here's David. He's saying, you know what? I don't have the Ark of the Covenant with me, but I've got the God of the Ark with me. Arise, O Lord, and be my defense. And Lord, be the one who fights this battle for me. It's an interesting thing. I don't know exactly when this particular statement or this particular psalm was written, but I have to believe that it was sometime when David is in the midst of this move, you know. I don't think he waited to the end to write. I believe he wrote it while he was in the middle of it. And would you look at that again? Would you look at verse number 7? Arise, O Lord, and save me. Well, if you read the story, right in the middle of this whole thing, God places David's friend, who becomes the counselor for Absalom, who gives him counsel that defeats him. He removes a counselor that would have, if Absalom would have listened to the counselor Ahithophel, he probably would have overtaken David, but God defeated that counsel. You know why? Because David didn't have to fight this battle. God fought it for him. His dependence was on the Lord. And I got to tell you, we got to get to the point, folks, where we quit fighting every battle for ourselves. Now, there's a time that you need to defend yourself. There's a time when you're supposed to do all that you can do. But I'm going to tell you something. Our defense and our dependence needs to be upon God Himself. Not in our ability, not in what we can do. Would you notice the rest of verse number 7? David remembers his past. He says, arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Well, maybe he's thinking about good old Goliath. Maybe he's thinking about some of those other battles, and he saw God's mighty hand, so he's just kind of reminding God what He's done in the past and reminding himself about what's happened in the past. And then what you notice, he acknowledges God for the victory, verse number 8. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord, thy blessings upon thy people, Selah. Well, God knew where to look for, or David knew where to look for the victory, didn't he? Hey, salvation belongeth unto the Lord, thy blessings upon thy people. Well, what do you think about that? I just like that thought. What do you think about that? It's a great story that's contained here in this psalm. May God help us understand that we're going to have trials. And in the midst of those trials, there are going to be moments, great moments of difficulty. And then may God help us in the midst of our trial to look to God for triumph. Let's bow our heads together in prayer tonight, please.